Sean Combs because my experience was not what the world has seen and how he's been, misrepresented. I'm not saying that every man is perfect. I'm not saying that all of us don't have flaws, but I can't, with any sense of humanity, not recognize the valuable contributions that this man made for us as Black entrepreneurs, for us as businessmen, for us as...
He feels like he was wronged by a lot of people around him, and Usher was one of the people that presumably knew what was going on in Justin's life and stood back and said nothing.
Usher is one person who could have understood Justin's point of view because he was a young teen star who became the...
Everything you are about to hear started with a video the internet forgot, until it didn't. A 2009 clip of Diddy standing next to a teenage Justin Bieber. At the time, it looked harmless. A moment of fame, a mentor, a rising star. But years later, that same clip came back with a completely different meaning. Because now, people are no longer watching it the way they used to. They're asking questions they never asked before. Why would a 40-year-old music mogul casually say he had 48 hours with a 15-year-old superstar? And why did everyone laugh instead of question it? That single moment is now being pulled into something much larger. A pattern that connects names the industry always kept in separate conversations. Diddy, Bieber, Usher, Ellen DeGeneres. People who were once seen as unrelated parts of entertainment history are now being placed inside the same uncomfortable narrative. And it didn't start with an accusation. It started with observation. Then came Joe Rogan, who didn't present new evidence, but something far more dangerous. A reinterpretation of old footage the public thought they already understood. And once that happens, nothing looks the same again. Because suddenly, these aren't just celebrity moments anymore. They start to look like pieces of a system nobody was supposed to notice. A system built in plain sight, hidden only because no one connected the dots. And the more people go back and watch those old clips, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. But the real question is not what happened in those videos. The question is, how much of this was always visible, and we simply weren't ready to see it? What makes this clip so unsettling today is not what is said, but what was never explained. Back in 2009, Justin Bieber was not just a rising star, he was the biggest digital-era discovery the music industry had ever seen. A teenager pulled from YouTube, placed into global superstardom almost overnight, surrounded instantly by managers, executives, and industry giants who all had access to him before he even understood the scale of his own fame. And that is where the timeline begins to get complicated. Because in that same early period, Diddy, already a fully established mogul, someone with decades of influence inside music, business, and entertainment, appears next to him in a way that, at the time, no one questioned. Not because it was normal, but because the industry trained people not to question moments like that. The video itself is simple. A conversation. Smiles. A casual tone. Diddy speaking confidently about spending 48 hours with Bieber. Bieber standing there, young, smiling, unaware of how that moment would be reinterpreted years later. But today, that clip is no longer being watched in isolation. It is being reconnected. And once connections begin, the story changes shape. Because shortly after that era, Justin Bieber's life begins to publicly spiral in ways that the media constantly framed as fame pressure, child star burnout, or growing up in the spotlight. But now, in hindsight, people are re-examining the timeline differently. The emotional breakdowns, the sudden behavioral shifts, the distancing from certain industry figures, the visible discomfort in interviews that once seemed like typical teenage rebellion. And most importantly, the silence around who had access to him during those formative years. That silence is what Joe Rogan focused on when he brought this back into discussion. Not by claiming new events, but by pointing at the structure surrounding them. A structure that includes powerful figures moving around young talent with very little oversight. And when you start mapping those interactions, another name starts appearing in the conversation more often than expected. Usher. Because Usher was not just another celebrity in Bieber's orbit. He was directly involved in his early career development, one of the figures who helped introduce him into the industry pipeline. And now, years later, clips end. Resurfaced commentary began asking uncomfortable questions about what was seen, what was ignored, and what was normalized during that transition period. But the most controversial part of this entire narrative is not even Diddy. It is how casually the industry ecosystem operated around it. Because in entertainment, proximity is everything. Who you are seen with matters almost as much as what you do. And in Bieber's early rise, his proximity to powerful figures was constant. Executives, producers, established artists, media personalities, people who shaped the environment he was growing up inside. And that environment is what Joe Rogan's commentary indirectly challenges. Not by making accusations, but by questioning why certain interactions were never questioned at the time. Why certain clips were never analyzed deeply. Why certain relationships were treated as normal when, in hindsight, they appear far more complex. Then there is Ellen DeGeneres, a name that enters this narrative in a completely different way, yet still becomes part of the same discussion once the internet begins reevaluating old footage. Ellen's interaction with Bieber over the years was publicly framed as playful, comedic, and part of daytime entertainment culture. But when you place those moments alongside the broader discussion about industry control, access, and influence over young stars, the tone of those clips starts to feel different. Not because anything new has been proven, but because perception has changed. And perception is powerful enough to reshape how history is viewed. This is what makes the current discourse so unstable. It is not built on a single event. It is built on reinterpretation of multiple old events through a new lens. And once that lens shifts, everything becomes part of the same puzzle. Even things that were never meant to be connected. But here is where the story takes a more serious turn. Because behind all of this public discussion, there is still one undeniable fact. Justin Bieber himself has never publicly detailed what he experienced in those early years in a full, direct, transparent way. There are fragments, interviews, emotional comments, reflections about trust, fame, pressure, and betrayal, but never a complete account. And that absence of clarity leaves room for interpretation. Some see it as normal privacy. Others see it as unfinished history. And that gap is where speculation grows. Because in the absence of answers, people build theories. And once those theories enter mainstream discussion, they begin influencing how old footage is understood. This is exactly what happened when Joe Rogan revisited these clips. He didn't add new facts. He reframed old ones. And that reframing is what caused the internet to reopen a decade-old narrative that most people had already mentally archived. Now, every resurfaced clip becomes evidence in the public imagination. Every old interview becomes a clue. Every interaction becomes part of a possible pattern. And whether that pattern is real or not becomes secondary to how strongly it is being perceived. Because perception, once it reaches scale, becomes its own force. And that force is now pulling multiple figures into the same conversation whether they intended to be part of it or not. Diddy, Bieber, Usher, Ellen, Rogan. Separate careers, separate timelines, now merged into one ongoing public investigation that has no official endpoint. And the most important thing to understand is this. None of this is being driven by one confirmed revelation. It is being driven by the reevaluation of old visibility. What was once ignored is now being analyzed. What was once normal is now being questioned. And what was once entertainment is now being reinterpreted as history that was never fully understood in real time. And as more clips resurface, the questions only multiply. Not about what we already know, but about how much we never asked at the time. Continuing directly from where we left off. Because once a narrative reaches this stage, it stops being about individual clips and starts becoming about the system those clips came from. And that is where the story takes a sharper, more uncomfortable turn. As the internet re-examines the early 2000s and 2010s through this new lens, another layer begins to surface, not just who was around Justin Bieber, but how the entire entertainment ecosystem was structured around young talent at that time. Because Bieber was not an isolated case. He was part of a machine that takes raw talent, often very young, and rapidly places them into a world of contracts, collaborations, appearances, and industry relationships before they fully understand what access really means. And within that machine, proximity becomes power. The more powerful the figure around you, the more normal their presence is assumed to be. That is why the 2009 Diddy clip went unnoticed for so long. It didn't look unusual inside that system, but outside that system, it starts to raise questions that were never asked at the time. And now, years later, those questions are being asked all at once. Joe Rogan's commentary didn't create those questions, it amplified them. And when he described a network of facilitation around young celebrities, the internet immediately began mapping that idea onto existing public moments. Ellen DeGeneres interviews, award show interactions, behind-the-scenes appearances, charity events, talk show culture, music industry collaborations. Suddenly, everything becomes part of a potential structure, not because evidence has changed, but because interpretation has. And once interpretation changes, the past stops being fixed. It becomes flexible. That is what makes this situation so volatile. Because in that reinterpretation, Ellen DeGeneres' name begins to circulate in a completely different context than before. For years, she was viewed primarily as a daytime television icon, someone associated with humor, generosity, and mainstream entertainment culture. But now, older clips involving Bieber are being rewatched with a different emotional lens. Not because anything new happened in those moments, but because the audience watching them has changed. A simple interview joke that once passed as harmless now gets analyzed frame by frame. A casual comment now gets treated like possible coded meaning. A public interaction now gets interpreted as part of a larger behavioral pattern. This is how modern media archaeology works. It does not rely on new footage. It relies on new suspicion. And once suspicion becomes widespread, even neutral content starts to feel loaded. Meanwhile, Usher's name re-enters the conversation in a more complicated way. Because unlike Diddy or Ellen, Usher's connection to Bieber is direct and documented through mentorship and early career development. That makes him a structural link in the timeline, a bridge between early industry access and mainstream success. And that bridge is now being re-examined through a completely different lens. Not because of anything newly revealed, but because of the emotional framing surrounding Bieber's early fame journey. People are now asking not just who was present, but what presence actually meant in that environment. Was it mentorship? Was it management? Was it exposure? Or was it something more ambiguous that the system never clearly defined? That ambiguity is where the narrative becomes unstable. Because ambiguity allows multiple interpretations to exist at the same time. And when millions of people start interpreting the same old footage differently, a collective narrative shift begins. But there is another critical element in this entire situation that often gets overlooked. Justin Bieber himself. Because throughout all of this renewed analysis, he remains largely silent on the specific framing being discussed online. He has spoken in fragments over the years about fame, mental health, trust issues, emotional exhaustion, and the pressures of growing up in the spotlight. But he has never fully confirmed or denied the deeper interpretations being attached to his early career environment. And that silence becomes part of the discourse. Not as proof of anything, but as space for speculation. And in internet culture, silence is never neutral. It is always interpreted. That is why every resurfaced clip now carries double weight. One layer is what is actually happening in the video. The second layer is what people now believe might be behind it. And those two layers do not always match. Joe Rogan's involvement in this discourse intensified that gap. Because his platform does not operate like traditional media analysis. It operates like open-ended questioning. He does not finalize conclusions. He expands uncertainty. And in doing so, he gives existing suspicions a structure to exist within. That structure is what the internet is now filling with old footage, forgotten interviews, and contextual reanalysis. But the important distinction here is this: no new official investigation has been triggered by this discourse. No legal framework has changed because of it. No verified document has emerged to support the broader interpretations being made online. What has changed is public perception. And perception, once scaled, behaves like evidence even when it is not. That is why this narrative is spreading across platforms so quickly. Because it is not dependent on a single claim. It is dependent on pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is powerful, but also subjective. It connects dots that may or may not belong in the same system. It merges timelines that were never originally intended to be read together. And it transforms entertainment history into something closer to a reconstructed investigation. Which brings the story back to its central tension. Are we looking at a hidden structure that was always there? Or are we looking at disconnected moments? Being forced into a pattern by modern interpretation? That question is no longer answerable through clips alone. Because the clips have not changed. Only the audience has. And as long as that remains true, this story will continue to evolve not through new events, but through new ways of seeing old ones. And that is why this discussion is still expanding instead of closing. Because once people start seeing patterns, they rarely stop looking for them. Even in places where nothing new is actually happening. Continuing directly from where the interpretation begins to expand beyond individual clips and into something far larger. Because once a narrative reaches this point, it stops behaving like a collection of isolated memories and starts behaving like a structure people believe they can map. And that is where the final layer of this discussion begins. As the internet continues to revisit old footage involving Justin Bieber, Diddy, Usher, and Ellen DeGeneres, something subtle but important starts to happen. The focus slowly shifts away from what is proven and moves toward what is perceived as connected. And that shift changes everything. Because now, every resurfaced clip is no longer just entertainment history. It is treated as a possible fragment of a larger system that was never officially acknowledged. But systems like that, whether real or imagined, only grow stronger when people keep feeding them interpretation. And that is exactly what is happening here. The 2009 Diddy video is no longer viewed as a standalone moment. It is now placed at the beginning of a timeline that people are actively reconstructing. A timeline that stretches through Bieber's early fame, his rapid rise, his public emotional struggles, and the many influential figures surrounding him during that period. But what makes this reconstruction so powerful is not the evidence itself. It is the emotional logic people attach to it. Because when audiences see a child star navigating extreme fame at a global scale, the assumption of imbalance naturally appears. Power imbalance, experience imbalance, control imbalance. And once those ideas enter the interpretation, they begin shaping how every past interaction is understood. That is why Joe Rogan's commentary had such impact. Not because it introduced new facts, but because it reframed old footage as part of a question rather than a memory. And once something becomes a question, it never fully settles again. It keeps evolving. Now, within that evolving narrative, Ellen DeGeneres becomes a symbolic reference point. Not because she is legally or officially tied to any of the claims being circulated online, but because she represents a broader era of entertainment culture that people are now reassessing. An era where interviews, jokes, and celebrity interactions were consumed differently without the level of scrutiny that exists today. And when those same moments are replayed in a new cultural climate, their tone shifts even if the content has not changed. That shift is not evidence. It is perception. But perception, when shared widely, starts behaving like collective memory. And collective memory is powerful enough to reshape how entire eras are remembered. Usher's role in this narrative remains structurally important because he represents the early gateway into Bieber's professional world. And that gateway is now being reinterpreted through modern concerns about access, influence, and responsibility within entertainment mentorship systems. But again, what is being analyzed is not new information. It is old information seen through a new psychological framework. And that is where distortion can begin, because frameworks determine meaning as much as facts do. Meanwhile, Justin Bieber remains the central figure around which all of this interpretation rotates. And yet, his presence in this discourse is largely indirect. He is discussed more than he is heard, referenced more than he is explaining. And that imbalance creates space for narrative expansion. Because when the central figure, no verified legal finding has expanded this narrative into the broader structure being discussed online. No official investigation has confirmed the network interpretation being suggested in commentary spaces. And no court of law has validated the idea of a connected system involving all these figures in the way internet discourse often frames it. What exists instead is a collision between historical celebrity footage, modern reinterpretation, and evolving public sensitivity toward power dynamics in entertainment. And when those three elements overlap, narratives become larger than their original scope. That is why this story continues to circulate, not because it has reached a conclusion, but because it has reached a point where conclusion is no longer the objective. The objective has become interpretation. And interpretation, unlike fact, does not close. It expands. So the real question this entire discussion leaves behind is not about what happened in 2009 or 2015 or any single interview clip. It is about how audiences now process fame itself, how trust is assigned to public figures, how silence is interpreted, and how quickly old entertainment content can be redefined under new cultural understanding. Because once a society changes how it sees power, it also changes how it sees the past. And in that shift, even familiar moments become unfamiliar again. Not because they changed, but because we did. And that is where this story ultimately lands, not in resolution, but in reinterpretation. A reminder that in the digital age, nothing is truly archived as final. Everything remains open to being reseen, re-asked, and reimagined. Before we close this, the real weight of this entire discussion isn't in the clips, the names, or even the timelines people keep revisiting online. It's in the questions that are still unanswered, and the discomfort those questions create when old footage is seen through a new lens. Because once a narrative like this enters public space, it doesn't end when the video stops. It continues in comment sections, debates, reactions, and the way people reinterpret everything that came before it. And that's exactly why this conversation keeps expanding instead of fading. Some people will look at this and see coincidence. Others will see patterns. And many will remain somewhere in between, unsure where interpretation ends and reality begins. But what's undeniable is this: the way audiences now consume entertainment history has changed permanently. Old clips are no longer just memories. They are being re-examined, reanalyzed, and reconnected in ways that reshape how entire eras are understood. And whether you agree with the interpretations or not, the curiosity they create is real. So now the question comes to you. After looking at everything, the resurfaced footage, the commentary, the connections people are debating online, what do you think is actually happening here? Is this just the internet reinterpreting the past with modern eyes? Or are we finally noticing things that were always visible, but never questioned at the time? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly where the real conversation is happening. If you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we go beyond headlines and into the structure behind the stories, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next time something old resurfaces, you won't see it the same way again.